Well, good afternoon. Welcome back from break. I'm hoping you liked the ice cream, or at least if you didn't want to eat it, you avoided it with all of the temptations. So we have a panel now that relates to leveraging geospatial standards. So everything geospatial, everything has a location and time, those kinds of topics are what we're going to talk about. I'm George Percivall. I'm the Chief Engineer and CTO of the Open Geospatial Consortium. I'm joined by three experts on the topic, and actually I'll introduce them as they come up. But allow me to give a little bit of sense of what we're going to talk about here in terms of location, and in particular from an OGC kind of perspective about how we see location and cyber and geospatial. So I'll break it up into three parts. First part is about how to use location with respect to achieving the mission, if you will, how location provides for shared situational awareness, for example, common operating picture, those kinds of themes. Everything has a location, pulling it together can give you a perspective that you didn't otherwise have. So we've been doing that kind of a theme within OGC's interoperability program, for example, which is our innovation labs, if you will. Seems like every scenario that we use in our testing, our use cases, are heavily driven by this situational awareness scenario. We're going to hear very much about one of those in particular, and that's the geo for NIEM kind of perspective, and how do we share information with location accuracy in the NIEM format. So we'll hear a lot about that. We also have in the standards perspective, so we've got innovation labs, everything needs to be running code to win there, if you will. And then in the other side of our OGC programs is the standards programs, which is the consensus adoption program. And we have a law enforcement and public safety working group. In fact, one of the co-chairs, Jackie, is here, as well as a couple others from international are the co-chairs of that law enforcement and public safety domain working group. And so a lot of perspectives come into that working group. One of the standards that we have established, actually a profile on ZACML, so OASIS standard is GeoZACML, and that brings location into this broader ZACML standard. One of the key ways that gets used is in the identity and access management for spatial information. One of the use cases we see as vital is, depending upon who you are, you get different access to different levels of geospatial information. So if you know about geospatial information, the feature types is a key term. Features is geospatial features is the kind of information that you pass around. It's road networks, it's locations of buildings, that kind of thing. So one of the key use cases is, can you see the detailed features based upon who your identity is and that information sharing? So access to detailed geo information based on identity and tagging that goes along with that. So that's kind of the first thing, situational awareness and location. Everything has a location, and we can use it for law enforcement and emergency management. Second, cybersecurity and geo. So, the notion that we have clouds, and clouds is the key way that we have trendy information sharing. Well, that means location's not important, right? Everything's in the cloud, so location's not important. Well, actually, all those clouds are anchored in some server somewhere, and they're being accessed by somebody that's threatening the system from somewhere. So location is a key aspect of that cybersecurity and geo. We've been working with OASIS on this one as well, again, for years, about how do we combine the more general security standards with the geo access standards. So how do you get that identity into the geospatial access? So that's the second point, cybersecurity. Third then is process, and how does the process of project interoperability relate to this geospatial topic area? You saw Ashwini's model that he presented earlier that gave geo as one of the, forget if it was a pillar or a row, is it, So it's one of the organizing frameworks, as it should be, for the information that gets shared is geospatial, because everything has a location, right? So in particular in that, we'll have a discussion about the geospatial interoperability reference architecture on GIRA, and the processes and the like that we're now defining within project interoperability across the SDOs to get that done. So that's kind of the framework that I provide. I mentioned that it's important for us to include this security early on in all of our standards creation instead of later as an afterthought. We think we need to have security up front. So with that kind of framework and that kind of mantra about early and often for security, allow me to turn to the panel. And like I say, I'll introduce each one of these. First, David Alexander is the director of the Geospatial Management Office within DHS, and David actually has some slides, so I don't know if you want to come up here. Probably be easier to do that, and all you got to do is hit the down button. Should be your first slide.
So I got a few slides. I'm going to just give you an overview of GIRA, which was a partnership between several agencies: Homeland Security, NGA, Commerce, NOAA, and the Program Manager for Information Sharing Environment. Before I kind of describe what the GIRA is and how it relates, I wanted to frame it in context to a larger geospatial perspective. So from Homeland Security's geospatial information sharing strategy and approach, we try and link the operators to policy and the mission investments to capability, and we want to ensure that all those investments are interoperable and can be reused to drive both effectiveness and efficiency. So we have sliced the domain into some layers, i.e., we all like map layers in the geospatial community. So how can we carve up and drive some synergy across those different investment domains? So we looked at unifying force between Homeland Security transcending both the intel community. So on the left side of the slide for the audience, we have the National System for Geospatial Intelligence and a series of standards and activities and processes and procedures that have matured and emerged through that lens of the community. And then on the right slide, we have the FGDC, or the civil geospatial community, and a different set of standards in many cases and processes and procedures that have merged. One of the things that Homeland Security sits in a unique position, and one of the significant justifications for the partnership here, was to try and bring commonalities across those communities and bridge some of that culture and promote more interoperability on capability. So we looked at, from our standpoint, what is the mission? So George talked about cyber. Well, if you look at the Homeland Security mission, we have law enforcement mission, we have cybersecurity and critical infrastructure mission, we have emergency response and incident management mission, we have maritime domain, border protection missions, we have domestic nuclear detection missions, we have health surveillance and biosecurity missions. So we have a pretty broad, diverse swath of mission sets, and we wanted to understand who those players are, what their stakeholders are, what is the user community they're supporting, what kind of content are they interested in and do they need to support their mission, what kind of resources and capabilities are they leveraging or are emerging in the marketplace around those missions, and how can they be brought together to provide not just a uniform picture of events on the ground to drive better situational awareness, but also as an analytic capability to partly connect the dots, as well as safeguard our assets, both in the field as well as the information that we may be relaying. So we looked at the mission, we looked at common operating data that is required across the mission set. We then said, okay, if we've got these missions with all these capabilities and we've got all this data, where is the architecture that can start to unify these investments and provide guidance where these diverse missions cross? And how can we start to drive adoption of capabilities in information sharing like NIEM, i.e. the NIEM, Geo for NIEM activities? That's really what the GIRA is intended to do, It starts to provide that blueprint, that guidance, so that we can transform the geospatial community and drive towards the sharing of assets, the sharing of resources in a standard way across a diverse culture. So we developed it under the auspices of the PMISE. It is to document geospatial architecture policy, provide some authoritative practices, and some guidance tools. It's to provide a framework for both executive leadership as well as managers and solution architects. So it's really hitting three communities. In a later slide, I elaborate on that. You know, executive leadership that controls the portfolio and manages the portfolio, program managers that are responsible for execution, and solution architects that are responsible for providing the capabilities to fulfill those program needs. You know, here's how it fits in. So if I flip back to my previous slide and I talked about these two communities that oftentimes work in their own unique processes and procedures and domains coming together, it's the same here in architecture. On the left side, you've got the IC community. On the right side, you've got a civil federal community. Where is the bridge between the two? So you have the information interoperability framework, and then you have a series of supporting reference architectures below that. We have an identity management, i.e. the importance of understanding identity and location and how those come together to safeguard and deliver the right information. We've got the geospatial interoperability reference architecture, which drives how we better understand and instantiate location and the ability to display geographically information. And then we've got the data aggregation reference architecture, which starts to blend all that information together and produce better actions based on analytic results from that information. So what were some of the goals of the activity? You know, one is to provide some guidance around governance, not just governance at the broad community level, but also how to provide some guidance to departments on best practices around governance and managing their programs and investments to ensure that they're aligning to the GIRA and other best practices like NIEM that are out there in the community to facilitate more informed and effective information sharing. It was just to serve as a baseline target reference architecture. So where do they go to look for those requirements? Where do they go to look to understand what those guidelines are? This starts to pull it together into one place. One of the things we're doing now in the next steps is we're looking to instantiate this on the Geo platform. That also starts to bridge diverse cultures. You've got a geospatial culture that has not always been very embracive of reference and enterprise architecture. If we put the reference architecture on the platform that we're driving those investments to register their data, we start to give more awareness on the value and what this is and how to align. We also provide a mechanism for us to curate the architecture and maintain it and evolve it as the community moves forward. So it'll link them to those best practices. It will link them to technical resources to where if they have questions and want to learn about another investment, they can identify those investments. How are we going to do that? If you have the GIRA instantiated on the Geo platform, we're also working through the FGDC on instantiating a geospatial marketplace on that platform. So now not only can they go in and identify what investments are available across the civil community, maybe it's data that's already been provisioned and they need to know how to find it, how to access it. Maybe it's other system capability or software or technical capability that's been provisioned. They'll be aware of it. Now they'll know if I need to implement and I need to deploy, what are the reference standards? And has someone else already done this? And can I learn from them? So we start to get a little bit more synergy and dialogue across the community, which can promote more cost efficiencies as well as it should drive more effectiveness. If we can flip the equation, 80% of, particularly in the geospatial community, 80% is finding data. 20% is them using the data. We want to flip that equation. We want to make it 20% at worst is go find the data you need to make a decision and to produce an analytic result, and spend 80% on producing better, more accurate, more precise, and more effective analytic results and delivery of that data in a digestible and understandable way. And then we want to ensure that we're aligning our investments to existing architecture and current architecture practices. So what is the GIRA and what is it not? It is a descriptive, not a prescriptive, so it provides guidance to drive them towards the right interoperability considerations. It drives them towards where existing investments may be made so that they can leverage those best practices, leverage those lessons learned, leverage the assets to promote reuse, as well as drive better exchanges across the community. And it provides us a mechanism, particularly if we instantiate it into the geospatial marketplace, it will provide us an opportunity to compare investments and the capabilities that those investments deliver for the enterprise. And then what is it not? So it isn't a prescription. It doesn't replace some of their solution architecture. It guides the way the department evolves both their geospatial enterprise architecture as well as the way departments will mature their solution architectures. It isn't designed as, again, to support these three groups, both executives, program managers, and the solution architects. It is intended to cross what we would consider from a homeland security perspective, our enterprise. Our enterprise is not DHS proper. Our enterprise is the whole of the nation. We touch federal, state, local, tribal, territorial, private sector partners, NGOs, the citizens. We interface with them all, so we wanted to make sure that we were driving exchanges that could support all those equities. It is intended to support authoritative referencing, so it does point to key artifacts that are available around geospatial. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want to promote adoption of mature and existing capabilities as well as reference guides. So it does drive them to the Homeland Security geospatial concept of operations. It drives them to the geospatial profile. It drives them to the federal enterprise architecture. So it points them to the appropriate resources based on the intersection or interlinkages of those domains. So it would point them to the identity access management reference architecture. We aren't going to reinvent identity and access management in geospatial. We're going to collaborate and reuse what the identity community is developing, maturing. Of course, we want to inform that community because location could be a key element to an attribute to determining how you safeguard information. It could also be a determinant on how you share information and when you share it and what you share. The approach was really to structure the document in a series of chapters, focusing really on process, less on policy. Process is where we really need to mature. So we wanted to provide those guidance and templates and reference artifacts to support that. So we are developing example charters, other exchange agreements that are best practices available to the community to facilitate information sharing across the different partnerships, as well as, again, we will point them to reference materials like the NIEM exchanges that are available. It was broadly socialized, so it kind of occurred in a couple of phases. There was internal reviews. We cross-referenced it across the PMISE pre-publication review, and then we socialized it to the FGDC and let both the NSG as well as the FGDC comment and provide feedback so that we could address and adjudicate their concerns to promote and encourage more broad and wide adoption as it's released. And now it's out and available for the community to use. I think the next steps are, like we said, we are working with the FGDC to put it on the Geo platform. It'll be a community of interest. And then I'm starting the dialogue with the Department of Interior through the FGDC on how do we connect the GIRA to the geospatial marketplace. If I can't link the reference architecture to where we're going to manage and understand our investments, then we're not going to necessarily get the awareness at the program management where we need it to occur.
Cool. Thank you. We'll take questions after all the panelists have a word to say. There we go. Thank you, David. Next, Justin, you want to come up here? Cool.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Justin Stekervetz, the Managing Director of the NIEM Program Management Office as well. Beyond wearing the hat of the Managing Director for the NIEM program, I do work for the Department of Homeland Security. So in this discussion, what I'm going to brief on Geo for NIEM, where it came from, where we're heading, keep in mind the lens that I'm supporting two missions, whether it's the NIEM community as a whole, which encompasses federal, state, local, tribal, and international, as well as the Department of Homeland Security. And a lot of what David had mentioned in terms of the architecture and mission space that we have to support. So Geo for NIEM, this has been an effort that was coined, I guess it was 3 years ago, but the effort really began back in 2012, actually at the Workshop for Information Sharing and Safeguarding Standards that was held back then, with an emphasis to address how to use NIEM for information sharing with geospatial standards. At that point in time, the version of NIEM that was available was NIEM 2.1, included a subset of geospatial objects that were identified through information sharing requirements from law enforcement, from emergency management, and so forth. As the years went by, we had interest from the U.S. Department of Defense in the adoption of NIEM, but also taking a closer look at how we go about embedding the geography markup language within the model, and how we could also potentially change the equation a bit and leverage the GML application schemas, or the schemas that allow you to place features on a map with NIEM components embedded. That particular effort, which now we call Geo for NIEM Part 1, since we're in Part 2, led to enhancements in NIEM that were found in version 3.0. We were able to take a number of recommendations that our partners at the Open Geospatial Consortium, through their leadership, to bring together a set of industry vendors, proposed to tighten the use of the geography markup language within NIEM, to promote additional capabilities where we might have geography features, but also to demonstrate that we can take the GML application schemas and embed vessel information, incident information, victim information, to showcase the information that is usually found within NIEM on a map. Moving forward to today, Geo for NIEM Part 2, we are taking that a step further. We're still focused on architectural contexts of our traditional space of information exchange, leveraging NIEM-based information exchanges, versus map visualization, where you would use the OGC suite of standards, but maybe you will embed NIEM components to provide a richer set of information. This year, through Geo for NIEM Part 2, in partnership with the PMIC, our friends at the Open Geospatial Consortium, we're taking a step further to also investigate what we did in the first year, coupled with access controls, identity management, access controls, round tripping, as well as leveraging APIs to publish features, update features, and again, this makes use of both NIEM conformant exchanges as well as GML application schemas with NIEM content embedded inside. That effort is ongoing. If you wait a few more months, we'll likely have presentations at, I believe, the June OGC meeting, where we'll actually run through demonstrations of the effort, and then we'll have final delivery of engineering reports and potential proposed ways forward, where our community members will have guidance on how to leverage OGC standards in a NIEM context, as well as enable access management controls around NIEM exchanges. For this particular effort, Geo for NIEM Part 2, we're focusing on a scenario that's related to flood inundation in the San Francisco Bay Area. And where this becomes more meaningful, from what you heard this morning around the maritime discussion and the Coast Guard discussion, we're actually taking maritime exchanges that are related to notice of arrivals. Ships are entering a port, levels of awareness. It's a separate exchange for if there might be a threat or some level of hazardous cargo on a ship, as well as mutual aid to demonstrate capability. So flood inundation happens in San Francisco Bay Area. Likely you'll want to keep the waterways open to evacuate the bay if needed, and granted, I am no expert in emergency operations. It's all hypothetical based on what I believe I know, and plenty of documentation thanks to the folks at California's Emergency Services Office. But how do you ensure that the appropriate people have access to the information that they need at the right time and on a map? So we're leveraging IC standards, specifically the trusted data format, that we can leverage trusted data objects embedded with NIEM components with access policies built in and security markings applied, so that if I'm a Coast Guard commander, maybe I'll have full information on the vessels that are found within the port. Maybe they contain hazardous information that might not be publicly accessible, but I should know about in order to have full situational awareness. Versus perhaps I'm a dispatcher or a state operations coordinator, and I need to know what the situation looks like, but maybe I don't need the depth of information, or maybe I shouldn't have the information about maybe classified material that might be on a Navy ship. We're going to demonstrate this within the next few months as we develop our reports and proposals. And then beyond the maritime aspect, we're also demonstrating mutual aid. If there's an incident that occurs in one jurisdiction, mutual aid, computer-aided dispatch, sharing resources that if I'm within the regional operations center for the coastal area of California and I need a resource that's in the inland region, actual regions, found that out, I can do resource sharing and I can see the information that I need to have access to from a dispatching standpoint. Again, if maybe I'm sitting at the State Emergency Operations Center and I'm working for the state and I'm a commander, I might have more information available that I can see all incidents within the affected area, as well as available resources across the state to bring resources to assist in a particular event. That's what this demonstration will hopefully show, that we can leverage NIEM with the Open Geospatial Consortium standards, which we already know, but we can also leverage standards such as the trusted data format, the IC standards, to encode information, to provide access controls, in order to promote information sharing. So with that, none of this would be possible if it wasn't for collaboration. I'm a big collaborator, and also from the role that PMIC has taken to bring groups together. It's been a very fruitful partnership, and I look forward to many more years of it.
Thank you, Justin. And so the ringer, Jamie from OASIS on GeoCyber.
That's the dang truth. I come here as the least of this distinguished crowd of geolocation experts, but we are happy customers. As George kindly pointed out, we've got any number of OASIS standards that basically rent out their geolocation problems to using something from OpenGeo, and vice versa. They're using GeoExactML in some of our work, and I don't even know who's using who, but anyway, they've been dating for years, and it's a happy relationship. So we're all learning how to get all our stuff to work, all our other stuff. We're going to talk in a second about the locational aspects of cyber risks, but just to make this real concrete for a second, because George earlier mentioned one of the older OASIS standards that's been around in this area in crisis response for a while, CAP, the Common Learning Protocol. Just to give an example, we will, I do, in fact, I'm in California, and you wouldn't think we're getting floods these days, but we do occasionally. For all that whining about there being no water, we are also getting flood warnings. And may I add, on my iPhone, out of nowhere, big annoying beeping noise, straight from FEMA, straight out of those CAP systems. I mean, it really works, and it really gets all the way to my iPhone, even when I'm on high, dry land and I'm told there's no more water. I'm still getting a flood warning, but we'll leave that aside. But at the same time as we want to be able to broadcast generalized warnings of that kind to people within a certain location, we also want to know that when, and I'm thinking of some of the work that Lisa Jones and our CAP Committee Emergency Management is doing, there is a schema for messages about SITREP reports. There is a schema for messages about hospital availability. So when we finally get out the initial information that the bad thing, the mudslide, the unexplained gunshot noises, the tremor, whatever it is, whatever the bad thing is, when we kind of figure out where it is, we're also going to have a whole series of follow-up messages from a variety of first responders, sensors, and sources saying, oh, and by the way, the nearest hospital is at X, or the people who need the nearest hospital are at X, or the hospital is at X and the people are at Y, and the resource to take them there is at Z, unfortunately, which is a known distance between X and Y. And we actually have to perform all those operations and all those conversations back and forth so that all those people from a variety of first responders and private industry participants and people phoning in to 411, everybody who participates in this, somehow we have to gather up all that information and know that we're talking about the same physical location, or else none of it works. So obviously we've known for well over a decade now that an electronic government fulfillment of first responder needs, we've got to get to apples. And we do now use these gentlemen are talking about some more sophisticated uses that are coming along. Pretty good apples to apples geolocation data in physical risk situations. But let's talk about cyber risks. Literally, I have met people who have been in touch with our friends at OpenGeo who say something along the lines of, oh, well, this is, it's cyberspace. It's everywhere and nowhere. Everything's in the cloud location. Doesn't matter anymore. On the other hand, if you read the newspaper for the last 4 years and read about some of these serious multi-company international penetration attempts and cybersecurity problems that some of our largest folks in that same floodplain called Silicon Valley were suffering, an absolutely necessary diagnostic step, part of the forensics of figuring out what happened, where did it get hit, where are the servers, where do they appear to be coming from, is where they appear to be coming from, where they're really coming from. It was all locational. If you delve into the esoteric area of all the arguments we're having nowadays about why a company has to insist, according to the law of a particular nation, that if you want to serve them, you have to have your servers within their territorial boundaries. We care where the servers are simply because somebody may require, for security or political reasons, that the service occur within a certain place. We had some stuff going on in Canada last year where there were Canadian provinces saying, well, you're not going to be using stuff for the government of blank province unless it's located within the territorial boundaries of the government of blank province. Now, whether you argue that makes sense or not, given the way that data runs around the internet, we are imbued with a continuing series of requirements to figure out where it was and to do forensic work based on who had it last and where it appears to have been and where it appears to have been going. So there's a tremendous physical location component to wholly cyber events. I guess I'll just make one more point there and then I have a question. I was at a cloud computing conference a couple of years ago, and we had a bunch of folks who got all excited. It was in London, or just outside of London. We got a bunch of folks who got all excited because they were saying, well, we're cloud providers and we're located in the UK, and because we're not located in the boundaries of the United States, you don't have to do with all that stuff about the horrible United States government. So we think you, good Europeans, should all buy your cloud services from folks in the UK, where we're safer and we know how to protect individual rights. And even during that conference, a bunch of other folks from the UK stood up and said, actually, as it happens, we have the same problems, okay? Jurisdictional boundaries will continue to matter when we try and trace the location of a cyber event. People are, whether correctly or not, assigning risk and taking steps and assigning levels of assurance or reliability based on where something comes from. And we can't escape that. We have a bunch of standards at OASIS that are reliant on figuring out where something came from. And when you talk about GeoExactMal as only one instance, increasingly one of the validating points for information is going to be not who's asking, but from where are they asking. You heard, if you were here for the maritime case discussion this morning, you heard the folks from the Coast Guard discussing how they are having to take a large amount of more or less public or at least not classified data and purvey it to a whole bunch of people really quickly, a very motley crew of local jurisdictions and countries we have a treaty with, and anybody else who might care what's going on in the port of Baltimore this week. And somehow they basically have to get it out based on location aspects. They need to know, okay, which port is this, what is it about, where was this guy going, and therefore who cares? And more and more of our work is going to depend on getting the right stuff to the right people, and that means that both the stuff and the people are going to have specific geolocated aspects that you have to match up in real time to do that broadcasting. So we are not going to be able to escape physical geolocation in the cyber field. Having said that, I want to get back to GIRA for just a second. Okay, you guys have foisted this on the world. Now, I am the CIO of the County of Frostbite Falls, Minnesota. And you know that that probably means I'm either a 30-year-old who's doing it part-time, or I'm the sheriff's cousin who knows how to run a computer, or I'm, some of those kids from 18F or some other nice agency who's, doing it for them as a coding project part-time for free. So they don't get too impressed by the CIO thing. What do I need to know? Does this thing say that there are services I'm going to take advantage of? Do I need to read it? Do I simply need to enjoy its benefits of being in the background? But out there at that end of the operating spectrum, what do I need to know or benefit from in GIRA? I want to get past the policy and say, what is it foisting on the world out there at the endpoints of responders and government agencies?
Yeah, so I think the biggest benefit is it'll start to point those types of stakeholders to best practices and existing standards for interoperability that they should be leveraging to ensure that their data can be exchanged as seamlessly as possible with their partners.
So it's going to give me models I don't have today for how to code this stuff up and actually
It's going to it's going to provide you a point of entry to discover NIEM and the geo components of NIEM. It's going to provide you a point of entry to discover the identity and access management architecture and its supporting standards. So you don't have to go to 100 different places anymore. You could just go there. And if we start to anchor it to things like the geo platform, the DHS GII, and other infrastructure, geospatial infrastructures, now it starts to connect them not just to the standards that they should start to leverage to promote interoperability and the best practices around governing those exchanges, but it starts to point them to other content that may be available to support their mission.
Okay, so just to bring it down to the real concrete, you're telling that 30-year-old, there's stuff available, this is the language it speaks, here are some function calls you can use to get it. When you get it, it's going to express certain things like location in certain ways. There's a way to read them, it's open, here's the information, and you can get to apples because you can take that and do whatever you need to do to transform it to your stuff. You might want to start using it yourself, because then you'll be able to use the information we broadcast out of the box.
Correct. And it'll be an iterative process. So we'll start with a little, and that's why it's important that the community curates it. As the community steps up and starts to curate it, we'll get a richer and richer body of knowledge behind the GIRA.
How far down this, it's great that I've got both of you guys here, how far down the stack are we going to specify standards? Are we going to say, you got to do, not just we're going to express geolocation this way, and we're going to use certain NIEM vocabularies, but you got to communicate with us in a certain way, you got to use our security model, you got to use our web services model, you got to use our API that is here, and you'd better be able to speak Python. I'm just making this stuff up. But how far down into the stack of interoperation behavior are you going to tell them that they have to do it your way?
I think that's a dialogue we have with the community, and the first step is to get the GIRA out there, start to get the comments and really the broad discussion going as to what do we need to do next with the GIRA. It shouldn't just be a prescriptive. It should be a collaborative partnership with the community at large. They should be coming back to us at the same time and saying, hey, we would like these things added to the GIRA.
And presumably there's a lot of sharing behaviors out there already.
Right.
Okay. So we've hit the first question
exactly,
that I wanted to ask, which was architecture. And Justin, I don't know if you have anything to add to the architecture element there, the value of architecture and the like.
Well, so I'll take Dave gave the DHS answer from a NIEM program standpoint. I didn't know panelists were going to question other panelists.
Oh, absolutely. I'm a lawyer, no shame.
From a NIEM standpoint, we serve a large community. So we can't be overly prescriptive because we know everybody's different. So what we do is we try to provide guidance to the community that they can take and run with. And if they have applicability to embedding GML within a NIEM schema, awesome, a NIEM instance. If they want to use the GML application schemas to post information, to map and have more context, great. We're providing the steps on how to get there and to also prove that it can be done.
So we've got the architecture, kind of the framework, the conceptual models and the like, and the value associated with that. Secondly, then, how do we take implementation in contrast and comparison and support? How does implementation, running code, relate to that architecture support? So maybe, again, David, you want to start? Or?
Yeah, so I think it comes back to your comment about one of the success stories is CAT, right? So it's not just CAP as a standard, it's the attributes that the community is rallied around that are associated with the different CAP exchanges that really makes it effective. It's the same thing. NIEM IEPDs, different communities are embracing the instantiation of IEPDs that describe certain characteristics to that exchange to ensure uniformity as well as the digestibility of that information across the different domains and stakeholder bases. So I think that's the next phase, is when you start to go beyond just, did you make an investment in a technology that supports these standards, to, are you adopting industry or community accepted exchanges to facilitate the streamlining of information across that requirement.
With
that
industry's engagement to actually
Exactly.
make that
That's what I said.
implementation.
Industry standards, it has to be a cooperative across the community at large, not just government, not just the private sector. It has to be a cooperative between the two.
Justin, anything to add to that? Or?
No, I'd just say, say cooperative to me is, again, that collaboration, having folks work together for the common good.
Okay. Jamie?
What you're hearing here, ladies and gentlemen, is strong agreement that we all have to approach this with a certain degree of humility. Because, if you put methods or methodologies or taxonomies out there and they lie foul and nobody uses them, well, that tells you something. Maybe you didn't explain it well, but more likely it's not an exchange anybody particularly cares to work on. On the other hand, we put out some kinds of messages or message exchange patterns or areas of taxonomic description, and they get embraced, used, elaborated, extended, and we find out that there's a robust, large number of people who care very deeply about using them. So we all have to we're all in the position of, in the world of providing these standards and methods, mopping up after reality and trying to, support the paving of the paths that people have already walked through the forest, because that's what the first responders turn out to need.
Well, and the words you used earlier today was use cases. We need to identify use cases. And earlier this morning, there was a lot of discussion about the need to identify use cases and the like. Justin spoke about the use case that we're using for the OGC testbed that's going on right now. It's the coastal flood inundation and the emergency response and preparedness associated with that. It's traditional almost to use an emergency response in some of these scenarios. That's an easy one, we know it, but what are the other use cases beyond kind of, the water's coming up and we need to get people deployed, first responders? What are the key use cases that we need to inform geospatial that you guys have seen perhaps in the GIRA that inform where we need to go?
So a lot of it, I turn around and say geospatial is more of an enabling capability than in this case. So we're looking to support the operators. So the operators are really the use case, not the geospatial community is the use case. The use case is the first responder that has to respond to a flash flood, right? Or has to respond to a national emergency. Where does geospatial capability and content fit in, and how can we ensure that that information is easily exchangeable? One of the points I think we're all making here is that there's a value proposition is that if you adopt these standards, you're in the core, you'll be able to easily share information across your diverse stakeholder base. And at the same time, we've ensured that many of these standards are adaptable or tailorable. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. They can extend NIEM, but the value proposition of adopting NIEM and the Geo for NIEM is that you can be assured that you can now relay information with these other federal partners. You can be assured that you may be able to relay it with these other private sector partners.
Jamie, you have something to add? You're looking at me.
No, I'm real happy with that. I mean, you read about that horrible German crash in the French Alps. There's so many of the things that happen to us physically are in places that aren't easy to map. You've got a lot of agencies, users, and organizations who sort of rely on street address and conventional grid stuff. And I mean, in California, we have a problem all the time that, hikers only seem to get lost or mauled in places that are not near any landmarks, roads, or otherwise. And, apparently triangulating themselves on their iPhone doesn't quite cut it. So, I mean, one of the offers that this system gives to first responders is we can up their game and get them to where they actually are supposed to be instead of having all the resources crossing back and forth and expend 4 hours they don't have trying to find it. And I have to say, I think there's an analogy to that in the cyber threat field as well. we are getting better at being able to describe what it means to transverse a network and find a node in a cloud system and be able to say it with enough specificity. And, you know, I mean, how many small prosecutors in states right now actually are having to deal with cybercrime issues? Well, answer, a lot of them, and a lot more than they expected, and a lot more than they have budget for. So being able to actually give them some, you know, some tools with which to describe this stuff and do that forensic work or even analyze the data they get with specificity is a big win.
I think that's another key use case that we ought to identify the law enforcement justice and perhaps maybe others in the NIEM. There's that the pie chart or whatever is the name that has all the different identifications of the domains. And so what are the other domains that are producing use cases beyond, say, emergency response, law enforcement, that we ought to think about when we're talking about these architectures that we're building?
So I think there's a human services aspect to it. I mean, humans are involved in the event, flooding event, so there's certainly going to be those. You know, outside the context of NIEM conformant content, I mean, there are certainly health effects. If you have flooding, you could have, you know, disease, things like that, that you might be able to do trending analytics and things like that. So those are certainly the two off the top of my head that, you know, sort of outside the traditional public safety law enforcement.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's going to be a health summit week coming up out of the White House that we ought to take some look at.
Well, I'll give you another one, and it's a darn uncomfortable one, and I can say this because I'm not a Fed. We are in, you know, the world of legal intercept, stuff like phone communications, used to be fairly simple. You'd want a certain kind of thing, you'd create a court order, you'd go to a phone company, you'd ask for a certain sort of thing, you'd get it. And we are now struggling with an explosion in the world of uncertainty about how we target and when we target, what we ask for and how we get it, and whether we got it or too much or the wrong thing or from the wrong place. Being able to precisely locate things physically and being able to precisely locate things in cyberspace is an important part of having privacy preserving, effective, but also, you know, working queries so we get the stuff we are supposed to get as well as don't get stuff that we don't need.
Tantalized to go to the privacy thing, but let's first see if there's anybody that has a question, wants to please come up. Oh, it's a race. I think she's got you beat, man.
All right. No fighting.
Well done,
okay,
sir.
I have a lot to say, but thank you so much for sharing with us what's going on. We've talked a lot about CAP. Back in the day, and this has been over a dozen years ago now that we developed CAP, we had a simple WGS84 as our location element, which that's way back, you know, and Dr. Carl Reed was our
Carl, man.
great
yeah,
guy.
There might be
he's,
more than that around.
Yeah, well, it's great that he's been able to help us, you know, whenever geospatial things came up. And it's taken us a while, but and CAP, we have to preserve much like it is because we're still talking to set-top boxes in really small countries that have no infrastructure. And then we also, on the other hand, have Google over here that's trying to drive CAP to be in a hierarchical structured data piece. And it's really a tough job walking that tight line in between, trying to keep CAP adoptable on the low end, but yet fitting needs on the high end. So that's a process that we're going through. Of course, CAP is the basis also for Google Public Alerts and Federated Internet alerts that you're getting from your ISP on your local. So CAP is doing great things, but we have other standards that have come along, which I thought, thank you, Mike Abramson, for mentioning the EDXL suite of standards, which include the hospital availability tracking of emergency patients, resource messaging, SITREP, and with those and the DE, or distribution element 2.0, we have engaged in the GML. So we have done that. In fact, our SITREP, the reason we got to a committee specification, this is probably news to you, Jamie, we pulled it back and said, wait, let's make sure we get the GML location piece and simple features included in that. So the whole family of EDXL standards, which began in 2003, with some very good input from first responder community and went through a scenario development and whatnot, and a lot of good field trials. CAP was that thing that allowed us the process that said, oh, okay, the EDXL family of standards will follow that process because it was a real good one. So that's the process that we've gone through with the other EDXL standards. So I'm interested to know about the Geo for NIEM, which is great, and I didn't realize there was a 2.0, so that's news for me. So I'd like very much to see how we can play the other EDXL standards into that, like our resource messaging. And we, as I've mentioned before, we have the adapters now for all the RM is a little bit hard because it's a set of 16 messaging specifications. That's the last one to be done. But our reference information model subcommittee has developed an adapter for NIEM. Thanks to NIEM 3.0, we have that nice ability to bring an entire schema in, and we were happy to know that GML for NIEM or Geo for NIEM did that. So that was a proof for us. So I'm very hopeful that we'll have an opportunity to bring those other standards in wholly and intact, so we can indeed have the interoperability that we need. Yep. Because if we piecemeal it, we're not going to have that interoperability across our many, not only domains, but international borders, and that's going to be critical.
So let's split that up kind of into two parts. First part being kind of the simple geo, and when does geo have to be complex kind of talk. When do you just use WGS84? And let me give an answer to that. And then Justin, if you can hit the other part of the coordination with the standards. So yeah, WGS84 works for many locations, right? Except, there's various places that it doesn't. We have a similar kind of discussion about, there's always an 80% solution that's, pretty good, We have one that's right now very popular in the geospatial world called GeoJSON. It is a JSON encoding of geospatial data, and it works very well if you like Web Mercator. And if you know what Web Mercator means, it is a nice element of describing geospatial information, but there are certain inaccuracies for certain use cases where you shouldn't use that. And so how do we provide guidance, in this case from a geospatial perspective, where GeoJSON is really good for a lot of good use cases, but if you go beyond that, how do you recognize that you need a little bit more sophistication in your geospatial accuracy, in your geospatial quality, those kinds of things. So that's something that we all deal with in our standards development, in our architecture. How do we develop profiles specifically for communities, and how do we handle that? So that's a continuing dialogue, but maybe on the coordination.
That one point, what some of the countries have done with regard to CAP is they've kept the WGS84, but like Australia has allowed the other coordinate reference system to come along in the package in the profile. So that's a great way to do it too. That way you have both, and then as long as the profiles are posted and discoverable, then people can use those. So
as long as people know what they're doing and get the right stuff for what they're doing, it's good.
So
that's
guys,
what we need to do.
As GIRA builds out, are we going to maybe see some of that guidance to the community about?
It's already in there,
So I think that's an important point. I think it's giving them the ability to reference other coordinate systems in their exchange, but making sure that they adequately describe that reference system so that it can be interpreted and transformed on the consumer side.
Fitness for use. You use the right profile for the job that you're trying to do, kind of thing.
We have issues with U.S. National Grid. It's the same issue,
yeah,
right?
Sure,
it works great in the U.S., but what about when you go into Canada? What about when you go into Mexico? That's, so, I mean, there's a lot of different use cases where a specific coordinate system may be most appropriate.
Mm-hmm. And where it
the
isn't.
challenge is more of making sure they describe that coordinate referencing system so that it's understood by the other user.
Exactly. Coordination between NIEM and others.
So for Geo for NIEM Part 2, we were looking for use cases that weren't in the first one, and since we were concentrated through the testbed that is occurring, that the work is occurring through is testbed 11, so it has an overall theme related to the flood inundation. So we thought the emergency management aspect is obviously a good concentration to have in this particular effort. The Science and Technology Directorate under DHS had recently executed work for mutual aid information exchange, and we leveraged that. But the beauty of the standards that are in use for the effort, specifically the trusted data framework format, trusted data format, is that you can plop a payload, a structured payload within that particular standard and encode access controls around it, and it doesn't matter if it's the mutual aid information exchange or some of the other EDXL related standards, and it would work just fine. We just took one or two exchanges. There were two related to maritime, the incident resource for mutual aid, and ran those through. But also, I think it's important to note that this sort of guidance is going to be important. When we did the first year of Geo for NIEM, we proved that yes, you could embed GML within a NIEM information exchange, and vice versa. You could use a GML application scheme with NIEM components. But there was very little in terms of advice on how to make that happen from a community standpoint. I think that's something this year we need to concentrate on, is that if there are those out in the field who are wishing to use these things together, that there is a set way or a template, so to speak, to go about doing that.
Sounds like a further conversation. We do have another question I'm open to get in before we finish our session.
And I'll just mention that a good application or a good opportunity to do that would be the healthcare, where we have the hospital availability and tracking of emergency patients, because that is very relevant today in the Ebola situation and tracking of these type of things. And it's also important to know that we are coordinating with HL7 on a transformation spec that will auto-populate the HL7 records. So that will be coming to ballot at HL7, which may be another standards body that we need to have around.
I guess a question back to you, is that work that's occurring under the committee under OASIS? Okay, yes. Great. Thank you.
Victor, right? Yeah, you presented earlier, so I know your name now. Please, your question. We have about 3 minutes.
We'll make it.
Okay.
So you get 1 minute for a question and 2 minutes for...
Okay, I promise to be quick. I'm going to start off with a story because it's a variation on the theme that you guys have been addressing. I recently looked at an air conditioning vendor's system, and this air conditioning vendor had access to not only where all of his customers were on a map, but to where the equipment that he serviced on a map, to, 6, 8 levels of precision and elevation. Cool. And he was overlaying all of the information about the equipment, and he was able to communicate this information to his subcontractors, and it was amazing. It was amazing. You guys all probably want to know the name of this guy because it was really good stuff. There is a lot of this kind of thing going on that is expansive beyond our frame of reference. And so the question is, how do we find and utilize stuff that is going on that is expanding the domain of geospatial usage and the use cases and JSON? The guy was using JSON to manipulate Google Map information in a very interesting way. Really, really interesting stuff. And I'll go on mute and take my answer off.
Oh, no, it's a very good point. Let me throw one thing in and then the panel the rest. I mean, yeah, what I do every day as a geospatial specialist kind of guy is talk to those varied communities. Tremendous amount of innovation in location-based services, location-based marketing, as you can imagine, which is highly tied up with that. But it gets back to the power of location. Everything has a location, and location is probably the number 2 indicator of intent. From a commercial point of view, the number 1 is what do you search on? Number 2, from a marketing point of view, is location. If I know where your location is, I pretty much know what you're going to do or what you are doing. It's amazing.
You think that works for baddies too?
So we have a panel comment. Sorry.
You think that works for baddies too? Is it possible that location is a significant indication of intent when we're trying to figure out the intent of a message, or
oh yeah,
it's
it's
benignness or its lack of benignness?
Probably
is it a forensic datum in evaluating something coming in?
Oh, so with respect to the cloud issue and where
if you get behind the statement that I'm a Nigerian prince and I want to deposit money with you.
Without a doubt. Without a doubt. Yeah. Anything else quick?
So I guess, from a NIEM standpoint, we rely heavily on the community to give us use cases and where we might be able to provide advice on how these things can work together. I think what's been very beneficial, and again, my favorite word, collaboration, has been that collaboration, whether it's coming here to OMG meetings to learn that NIEM, the UML profile for NIEM version 3 was approved by the architecture board, or learning about things that are happening in other domain working groups, whether it's healthcare, whether it's working with the Open Geospatial Consortium's Emergency Management Committee, the LEAPS Committee, just knowing what's going on out there that you can apply this stuff to and provide advice, or at least have insight of what you should be investigating.
Very good, very good. Last message, unless David has a last word.
I would just say to answer that is I think we need to invite the outside community to contribute.
Yes.
We don't know all the answers. We don't have all the solutions. We need to be a little bit more open and encouraging that's where the tactical edge is more often than not where innovation is spawned. where we need to, stimulate that conversation.
Okay, well, let's thank our panelists.